What it is, y'all, it's your old boy Pilk, and we need to come back and talk about Wistoria a little more. I'm still going through the backlog of anime versus manga, and today we're going to talk episode 4 versus manga chapter 5, because there's actually a ton to discuss here. We'll really just kind of jump into it here. Now, chapter 5 kind of kicks off, as we saw in the anime, with them fighting the golems and basically, preparing for the event. The big difference here, there's like 3 or 4 pages, in fact, from this point to this point to this point, pretty much to right here. Yeah. All that takes a span of about 10 minutes of the episode. It's kind of nuts. They really stretch this out. They give you a lot more dialogue, a little bit more background on characters. You get all this dialogue here, but the battles and all that are well animated. They're basically, what they do is just kind of flesh it out to a much greater degree than what you ever could in a manga format. So you see essentially everything that happens here happens and then some. They would show some background characters and some things like that. There are also 3 characters that I noticed that they introduced in this episode, but that we didn't understand the relevance of until much, much, much later. But of course, they show Will here getting knocked out. There's actually a conversation that kind of happens where Will's taunted a little bit and people even kind of mention him. There's a bunch of background characters. It's not super important. The only reason I mention it is because it does take up like 2 or 3 minutes of the episode, and it's just not in this panel. It's not anywhere in here at all. And then, of course, you have these guys that are just kind of clowning him after the fact. And then, of course, they start having to introduce some of the other characters. So you've got, like, Sion, and he kind of goes in there and just wrecks house. Oops, we went backwards there. Now, here's 2 characters that we know from much later, but for the life of me, I cannot remember her name. Liana. I think that's her name. Liana and Wingnall. And these 2... they kind of get an introduction here, but it happens so fast in the episode, it's really hard to grasp like what they mean for the overall series. Right now, as far as we know, they're just 2 people that are really good at this. They even call her Miss Perfect in this episode. Though, if I'm honest, it's just kind of a passing moment here. You just kind of get like 1, 2 pages of them, 3, and they're kind of gone. So, Liana and Wignall. Keep calling Wingnall, but whatever, Wignall. And they kind of mention that, like, she's got a perfect score. His is just south of perfect, but, it is what it is. They kind of pass and they move on. And then, of course, this is where they really introduce Julius, who is the main antagonist of this whole episode. And in this, he just kind of shows up and just kind of, he freezes everybody and they're done. But, in the anime, this is a build-up. He does that little, the ice rose trick, and he just shows off, like, absolute crazy. Like, this dude goes completely nuts in the anime. And here, it's just kind of a couple of cells. Now, in fairness, you kind of can't go to that extent in the manga anyway. But it's just one of the biggest differences between the anime and the manga. And then, of course, he passes and everyone kind of starts talking about him. And you even get Sion down here having his little fit, so to speak. There's just so much. They just took like, we're now right here, 13 pages in. And I want to say each page would have been roughly about a minute of animation, maybe a little less, maybe about 45 seconds of animation. But it's all like, that doesn't sound like much, but you got to figure this is like a quarter or more of the episode that we've already seen just in these few short pages. So it's very, very well stretched out. And then we get the intro, and then we have all this kind of back and forth between Will and Colette. In fact, when she slams her tray down, you see Kiki's kind of flustered, and you get a little bit more reaction out of Kiki, but they don't really give Kiki a lot of shine in the series anyway. or in the manga. In the series, she gets a lot more. So they're kind of talking about the festival and, we literally get this shot and this shot animated out, or what's not animated out? They're stills, but they're displayed for us to see in a little more brilliance. But each one of these shots is really replicated immaculately in the animation. They even talking about the 4 houses that essentially, 10 points to Gryffindor, but whatever. The 4 different houses that essentially you could more or less get adopted into. And she's like, if you're adopted in there, it's a thing. Now, here's one of the biggest changes between the manga and the anime. And I forgot to mention old girl here, whose name I cannot remember for the life of me. But she's the one that Will meets in the dungeon. Now, that's the one where she makes the biggest presence, and then you find out she's basically like one of the Watchers. That's actually what they're mentioning here. In the anime, they kind of give you a little bit of information. Like, they kind of show her off, and you're kind of like, oh, what's her deal? What could possibly be this? But, here it's extremely subtle. Like, she's just a background character. But what they're telling you with her being in the foreground like this and this block next to her, they're talking about the Watchers are going to be there. And in the anime, we didn't really, pick up on that, or I personally didn't pick up on that until, a couple episodes later when we finally get, her in the dungeon and all that good stuff. I think it's actually in the next episode. But this is her first introduction. So this whole episode that seemed really kind of blasé at first, when you go back and rewatch it, there's so much more that you don't realize. And they kind of talk about Will tried to show off in the first one, or that when they were year 2, and then now they're year 4. They do this every 2 years. He's expecting so much better out of it. He's like, year 2, or at this point he's trying to talk himself out of it, actually. But year 2, he was just completely embarrassed. And in the anime, this leads into something completely else. Now, we saw back with the episode 2, where Will has to fight Edward, the Professor Edward. He's in a math if I don't have the professor. Where the lockers are all magic, and they have these magic spells, and you have to be, you have to use magic to get into them, and all that good stuff. That doesn't happen here. You literally just go from one thing over to, the dwarves and all that. Literally here, you get, or in the anime, they have now this whole locker scene, and there's a little bit more dialogue, and then they have that whole underground betting thing, which is funny because it'll be interesting to now go back and compare, the manga now as we know it to what happens at the end of the series. 'Cause I know he does the whole $ things as an eyes and everything like that in the manga there. So here we haven't yet kind of gotten the explanation of that underground betting pool. I'm sure that'll come up later. It's almost got to be mentioned later, but to what depth? And here there's several minutes of they go in there, they meet Sion and all this stuff. It's a big deal in the episode, and here it never even happens. That whole betting pool thing never happens. We literally go from them in class. In fact, here they're kind of at the lunch table, then she's in class. It's implied here she's in class. This actually happens in one of the classrooms here, and actually that might still be the lunchroom because he's carrying the trays there. So there's just a whole back and forth thing that happens here that happens totally differently in the anime. Totally differently in the anime. Because in the anime, if you watch it, and I did, side by side, I had to double check everything, she's actually in a classroom here, not in the cafeteria. So, very different. But from this point on, there's very few changes. There's a couple. One that I think is really funny that I think the manga actually made a mistake. But we'll go through this here. So essentially, we meet the dwarves, and we get all the background on the dwarves. I don't got to bore you guys. Already watched the episode. You know how this plays out. But essentially, we meet them, and you meet Donovan, and Rosty's here. And Rosty's... It's funny how Rosty, the more I watch this, the more I pay attention, Rosty's kind of in weird places. Rosty is creeping hard on Will. So that whole episode where Rosty essentially more or less like admits to Colette that he has a thing for Will, makes a lot more sense. It is actually a little more creepy now that I go back and rewatch this, because he's like straight, like, I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat this. He's like everywhere, like borderline stalkerish. But because I mean, remember he was in the dungeon when we saw him towards the end of the series. So spoilers if you haven't watched that, but it's out there now. And if you haven't, I guess I haven't spoiled too much, but you'll see kind of what I mean when we get there. But nevertheless, as they kind of just have their little conversation, he's just kind of talking about the dwarves and really building them up. And there's maybe how many pages do we have here? 1, 2, 3. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages, and then Julius shows up. And in the anime, this goes on for a long time. It actually might be 6 minutes or might be even longer, but it goes on for a while. And interestingly enough, in the anime, and this is one of the biggest changes they made, well, not one of the biggest, but one of the most interesting changes they made. It's a kind of a narrative trope, but it doesn't happen here. Here, Julius just walks in. In the anime, there's this whole build-up sequence where Will drops a spoon. It's very symbolic of all this stuff, and then Will stands up and happens to notice Julius has walked in. Here, he just kind of goes in. There's no spoon. There's none of that like suspense, none of that build-up. Now, I do like the way they did it in the anime, because while it is a trope and while it is very stereotypical, it helps build a little bit of tension, and it is kind of one of those visual gags, so to speak, that really does kind of work as an icebreaker between these two like really lighthearted and extremely tense moments. It is a trope, but it's one I like. So essentially, obviously, you guys know Julius comes in, starts antagonizing. Really not a lot changes here, but what I thought was really funny and really interesting, after Julius is just talking mad smack about the dwarves and about everything else and Will himself, Will loses it. And he walks up there and he's just like, take it back. And Julius is like, nah. And he's like, Will loses it. He's like, yeah, you got no room to talk, dude. You're done. And he flips and he grabs the two like dudes and the basically the lackeys and these little toadies and throws them down. And he's like, we're done here. Bam. Business. And I mean, this is legit as close to literally standing out. I mean, you can see his foot. It's almost on his head. This is as close to literally standing on business as you can get in a series. And he stands back up. And this is something really interesting. I want you to pay close attention here. In the anime, they kind of fix something here. So when Will grabs these two guys and throws them down, there's no table. There's nothing. Like, there's a table here, and then the table's gone. But then clearly there's like a chair right there, but there's no table. And here, the table's back, but now the table's gone again. And then nothing's happened. He's just stood up. It makes sense the table would be there, but it's never moved. They never show it being moved. I guess you could imply that it's gone, and it's kind of a blink and you miss it type of situation. Like, I'm sure most people reading the manga the first time didn't even flinch, at this notion. However, in the anime, they make a big deal. When Will grabs these guys, the table gets flung, and you actually see it hit the wall and go slamming down. Now, it's a little south of what you would expect out of a character like Will right now, about me making a bigger mess, but it's kind of a loose end that I do like the fact that at least someone, when they were translating the manga into anime, figured out we have to correct this problem. Like, this is a weird thing, and we have to correct it. Slightly out of character for Will, but I do like that fact, because it's now that I'm reading it, it's just extremely jarring. But really, nothing else changes from here. I take that back. There's one other big change. So we have the whole ice fight, and Will basically like roundhouse kicks the ice, and is just showing off. And then he kind of like gets pinned to the wall by the ice, and this is another instance where Julius kind of does his little like frozen rose trick, but he never does it here. In the anime, he makes a big deal out of like, you know, doing it on his chest and driving it into his chest. Here, he's just kind of holding his wand to his chest like a pew pew. I don't want to say the word just in case. I mean, we're far enough in the episode, it won't make a difference, but still. It's a clear present danger. It's a legitimate threat. But he doesn't do the little rose ice trick. So one massive difference, because he has that obsession. Like, you can see it on his jacket here if you look really, really closely. If you're watching this on the phone, you just have to take my word for it. I'm sure enough people do in this day and age. But if you're not watching this on like a beautiful 1080p or higher resolution monitor, you won't see it. But his little rose ice thing is on his chest there. But he never does it to Will. He uses it as a pin. He never assaults Will with it. And that's another big change. So there's a lot of actual changes in this episode. And he grabs the, he breaks the ice, grabs the wand, and he's like, fine. I'll join your little magic fight thing. Let's do it. Like, you're going down. And he's like, if I win, you'll apologize. I called him Donovan. I swear there's different Donovan. Whatever, it doesn't matter. You can't tell, I'm really bad with names. So yeah, all that stuff, guys. It's really crazy. The next episode literally picks up on chapter 6, or the next page even picks up on chapter 6. So we'll have to talk about chapter 6 versus episode 5 coming out here real soon. But this was really interesting. They expanded on a lot. They added a lot. And I don't think it was obviously filler. I think it actually was something that made a lot of narrative sense. We'll have to see if they tie that together later on down the road. But for now, if you guys did enjoy this, you owe me a sub and a like. And I'll catch you guys on the next one.